Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
BBC World Service, coming to you from London, a city usually known for being fairly safe and secure, for many a place of refuge. Today, though, we bring you the extraordinary story of an audacious assassination that took place right here in the middle of London. A murder that shocked the world, and one that left radioactive poison all over the British capital. But who killed the former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, and why? I'm Richard Watson, and today I'm on the Polonium Trail.
This was an example of state nuclear terrorism carried out on the streets of London against a British citizen who as a result died a long and very public death.
I've been a consultant for over 20 years. I've never seen a case like this, and I hope I never do again.
I just promised to Sasha one day people will know the truth about him.
On the 1st of November 2006, Alexander Litvinenko, known as Sasha, met two men at the upmarket Millennium Hotel in central London. All three were former Russian spies. Litvinenko thought he was safe and amongst friends. He'd just become a British citizen. But 22 days later, he was dead, poisoned by radioactive polonium. For this programme, we followed the evidence at the public inquiry into Litvinenko's murder that's been sitting in London for the past 6 months and which has just finished its public hearings. And we've spoken to confidential sources close to the case. Our story begins 15 years ago when Litvinenko left Russia for Britain with his wife Marina.
I was scared from beginning to take this decision to go somewhere. But finally, I was very happy here for our family, for all of us. We've been all together, and we could see our son, who started his secondary school, all these 6 years, since 2000 till 2006. We were very happy.
Litvinenko had been a member of the FSB, the successor to the Soviet KGB, and he'd come to London after falling out with his former comrades in Moscow. 2 days after his meeting at the Millennium Hotel, he fell ill with vomiting and severe pain. From the start, he was convinced he'd been poisoned.
We did ask medical staff to check Sasha for poisoning. People didn't understand us, and they just thought we tried to make some conspiracy. But Sasha rapidly became worse. They tried to find something in his past life, even thought it might be cancer or anything, but of course no idea even to check him for poisoning.
Well, a colleague came into my office and explained that in hospital in North London was a man who was telling a quite extraordinary story. He was saying that he was a former member of the Russian intelligence agency and that he believed he had been poisoned by some of his former colleagues.
Peter Clark is the former head of counter-terrorism at London's Metropolitan Police.
And the question was whether this should be investigated by local police or whether it was an inquiry that should come to us in the counter-terrorism command. It was clear that there were going to be really very serious diplomatic issues relating to the intelligence agencies. So I made the decision to bring it into the counter-terrorism command.
As the severity of the situation dawned, the former KGB man was rushed from his suburban hospital bed to University College Hospital in central London for intensive care.
I never had in my life a race like this. It was just like a snowball because it just happened in one moment.
So suddenly the events started accelerating.
Yes, it was the first time when I met Metropolitan Police, and what is very important, Sasha was able to talk and they started to interview him.
So this was now an investigation into an attempted murder.
Yes.
We're in the, therefore, unusual position of having what you could describe as a living murder victim telling us how it was that he came to believe that he was meeting his death.
But doctors still didn't know what was wrong with Alexander Litvinenko. His white blood cell count was catastrophically low. Blood tests showed slightly elevated levels of the heavy metal thallium. He was given an antidote, but he didn't improve. Professor Amit Nathwani was a specialist blood consultant trying to work out what was going on.
His condition deteriorated. He'd be confined to bed, generally. His vital organs were being destroyed in a sequential pattern. It started with his liver and then was followed very rapidly by his kidneys and then his heart. And so we were in a race trying to work out the cause before some of the other organs were picked off. We could see that we were losing the battle right in front of our eyes.
When I came to see him, it was exactly what you saw in a picture in a newspaper. He could only be in a bed. After that, he never came out from this bed.
Yes, that photograph is etched on many people's minds, of course.
Yes. I think, why? Why nobody can explain what happened to him?
Radiation poisoning was suspected, but a Geiger counter check was negative. By this time, there were not only police by his bedside, but also government scientists from the Ministry of Defence and others in plain clothes. As Dr. John Goldston, head of critical care at the hospital, recalls.
The scene really was a mixture of individuals. Lots of people wearing suits.
Did these people wearing suits announce who they were?
Yes, sometimes. I mean, we knew that there were police officers, but there were some people who probably weren't police officers but were possibly members of the security services. And
Spooks?
Yes, possibly. I mean, I'm not sure, actually.
They didn't say, I'm working for MI6?
No, they didn't. No, of course not.
But the mysterious men in suits were discussing with the doctors some bizarre and disturbing possibilities.
They had had examples where people had died under strange circumstances. The sort of things that they were describing were where overseas there would be examples where a piece of a desk had been changed and inserted in its place some source of radiation which would then gradually poison somebody. I thought it was quite far-fetched.
By now, Litvinenko had been severely ill for 18 days, and doctors here at London's University College Hospital seemed to be no nearer a diagnosis. As a last resort, the decision was taken to send blood and urine samples to the government's top-secret nuclear research centre at Aldermaston. That's the site responsible for developing Britain's nuclear bomb. A confidential source with very close knowledge of events has now told me the fascinating story of how the poison was finally discovered. This has never been revealed before, and the story hinges on expertise and pure luck. The technique used at Aldermaston was called spectroscopy. One of Britain's most eminent particle physicists, Professor Ian Shipsey, one of the team that discovered the Higgs boson, the so-called God particle, explained how it works.
We take the blood and we place it into a vessel. We attach the vessel to a vacuum pump to remove all of the air. In that vessel is also a sensitive camera that can detect radiation if it's present in the blood. We attach the camera to a computer, and the output of the camera produces the trace that you see on the screen.
Aldermaston first looked for gamma radiation, and they noticed something very unusual, a small spike in the trace visible on the screen. Then, quite by chance, a scientist who'd worked on the nuclear bomb program overheard his colleagues discussing the unusual results. He immediately recognised this as a small gamma-ray spike of a rare radioactive element called polonium-210. He knew this because polonium was a component of early nuclear bombs.
Polonium is 100% deadly. It destroys cells, the immune system, and leads to organ failure throughout the body.
Does it surprise you that he managed to recognise that gamma spike?
For most people it would be hard to do, but with the right experience, it's like recognizing an old friend's face in a crowd.
I received a telephone call from police and they told me we need to see you. They said it's very special what news we need to bring to you, and we better you will know it's from us, not from TV or from media.
Alexander Litvinenko died on the 23rd of November.
When we arrived to hospital, I was not allowed to go straight to see him. I was asking to go to separate room, and I knew exactly what had happened. Doctor just said, if you want to see Sasha the last time, just to say goodbye, we allowed to do this.
The same day, Aldermaston confirmed it was poisoning by polonium. If Litvinenko had died a week earlier, it would have simply been recorded as an unexplained death. Polonium is highly radioactive, but it doesn't emit the kind of radiation that can be detected by Geiger counters, hence the early negative tests. So this was very nearly the perfect murder. As it was, Litvinenko's hospital room was now sealed off, and medical staff were traced and tested. His wife was told it was not safe to go home.
They said, another thing, we just realized it may be not safe place for you to stay in a house. It means in the same time I lost everything. I had only 15-20 minutes to get something with me and be out from house.
The polonium had now left its calling card all over London, in cars, on cups, clothes, tables and chairs, in public places all over the city. Even the London Underground was tested, according to one source, and found to contain traces of polonium. At the time, this was kept secret to avoid panic. In the end, over 40 sites were found to be contaminated with radioactivity.
Gentlemen, can you dress away from the front of the premises, please? You're blocking the pavement.
With the police cordoning off sites all over London, the two former Russian spies who'd met Litvinenko at the Millennium Hotel before he fell ill were identified as prime suspects: Andrei Lugovoy and Dmitry Kovtun. Traces of polonium were being found wherever they'd been. The Polonium Trail begins on the 16th of October 2006, when Litvinenko met both prime suspects. This is thought to be the day of a first murder attempt. The sushi bar where they had lunch was contaminated. They spent that night at the Best Western Hotel in Shaftesbury Avenue. Very heavy contamination was found in their rooms. Lugovoy was back in London on the 25th of October. His room at the Sheraton Park Lane was heavily contaminated. 3 days later, he flew from Moscow to London. Polonium was found on his British Airways flight. And then they met Alexander Litvinenko here at the Millennium Hotel on the 1st of November in the Pine Bar. This is where it's thought the fatal dose was secretly administered to Litvinenko in a cup of tea. Needless to say, the bar was found to be heavily contaminated. An intelligence source told me that when they mapped Lugovoy and Kovtun's movements onto the locations of polonium contamination, there was an exact match.
We were finding polonium in aircraft, in a football stadium, in restaurants, in hotels, and of course the public were understandably very concerned. Were they at risk? The Health Protection Agency were inundated with concerned members of the public.
Peter Clark of the Metropolitan Police once again.
Here the clearest evidence was that this was a substance which had caused Mr. Litvinenko's death. So the obvious line of inquiry is you follow the trail, and that's exactly what this investigation was. Trails of polonium across London and beyond, well over 40 sites of radioactive contamination.
In May 2007, the then Director of Public Prosecutions, Ken MacDonald, recommended the prosecution of one of the suspects, Lugovoy, for murder.
There was sufficient evidence there to charge Lugovoy. If he'd been in the United Kingdom, we'd have had him arrested and charged and put on trial at the Old Bailey. And it was because we'd come to that judgment that we thought it was right to seek his extradition. He was in Russia at that time, obviously.
The Russians have not extradited either Lugovoy or Kovtun. They point out that extradition is not permitted by their constitution. With no trial, the British authorities have had to satisfy themselves with the public inquiry. But British security and intelligence services work closely with their US counterparts, and I understand that the Americans have passed actionable information on the murder to investigators in London, and information on the alleged involvement of the Russian state.
This was, on the evidence that I saw, an example of state nuclear terrorism carried out on the streets of London against a British citizen who as a result died a long and very public death.
Were you persuaded by the secret evidence as well?
I looked at all the evidence. We looked at a wide range of material and we came to the conclusion that Lugovoy had been involved in this murder, and our view was that it was most likely that this was an execution ordered by a foreign state.
This then is the central question the Litvinenko inquiry has been asking. Did the Russian state have a hand in the murder? The inquiry heard strong scientific evidence that it did.
That's an aerial view of Sarov.
Sarov is a closed town in Russia. It doesn't appear on maps. Officially, it doesn't exist because it contains the avant-garde nuclear facility. Professor Norman Dombey, a physicist who gave evidence to the inquiry, explains.
Well, the avant-garde site is the old Arzamas 16, namely the first nuclear weapon site in Russia. And it has carried on designing, making nuclear weapons. But in particular, it is carrying on making polonium-210.
And there are relatively few places where polonium-210 is made.
At the moment, polonium-210 is only made in substantial quantities and regularly at avant-garde.
Professor Dombey told the public inquiry that the murder weapon, polonium-210, makes it almost certain that the Russian state was involved.
So much was used that it must have come directly from avant-garde.
That implies some degree of state control.
Absolutely.
It's not something a group of organised criminals can just buy on the open market.
Absolutely not.
President Putin denies any Russian state involvement in this. Do you think there is any conceivable way that commercial polonium-210 could have been used?
No.
You're clear about that?
Absolutely.
But what would be the motive for the murder? Marina Litvinenko points out that her husband had made enemies in the Russian intelligence service, the FSB, after speaking out over alleged excesses he witnessed and refused to be part of.
They've been asked just to kill people, to kidnap people, and of course it was absolutely not his idea what an officer of security service supposed to do. And he still believed it might be a time to change this structure, FSB.
As far as Moscow is concerned, Alexander Litvinenko was an agent who'd gone rogue. He was put on trial after blowing the whistle on corruption in the Secret Service. It was a major falling out with his former boss Vladimir Putin, who was then head of the FSB. He accused Litvinenko of assault and stealing explosives. The court found him not guilty, but he was re-arrested immediately and held in prison for almost a year. On his release, his friend Yuri Felshtinsky asked a former KGB general if he'd be safe.
He told me that Litvinenko committed treason, and this treason is punishable by death. And there is no way Litvinenko is going to be pardoned. There is no way the crime which Litvinenko committed is going to be forgiven. And that if he would ever see Litvinenko himself personally, if he ever meets him in a dark corner, he will kill him with his own hands. And this was kind of real. I mean, you really believe him that he is capable to do this.
Litvinenko fled to the UK and set up as a security consultant, advising companies that wanted to invest in Russia. But the inquiry heard how he had also begun working for Britain's secret intelligence service MI6. And some of his work for them appears to have involved targeting powerful men within the Russian state. In Spain, for instance, the security forces were raiding houses linked to the Russian mafia as part of a big investigation into alleged links between them and members of President Putin's government. It turns out that Litvinenko had been encouraged to help them in these efforts. Jose Grinda has spent 20 years investigating organised crime. In a rare broadcast interview, he told us how Litvinenko was useful because he too once investigated the mafia when he was in the FSB.
A mediados de los años 90, vienen a España determinados criminales rusos.
In the mid-90s, some Russian criminals came to Spain and they began to be investigated by the Spanish police and the Guardia Civil. Those people, those Russian criminals, had been investigated and were being investigated then by Litvinenko in Russia. Litvinenko and other people in Russia were already fighting against those organized criminals and giving us information. He was giving useful information to the Spanish police.
But there were other, even more significant motives for his murder. An intelligence source with inside knowledge of thinking in MI6 told me that he was killed because he crossed two distinct red lines.
The smouldering remains of 64 apartments, torn to shreds by a massive explosion.
This was the first red line, the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999.
To begin with, the Moscow police suspected a faulty gas main, but dazed eyewitnesses said they hadn't smelled any gas.
300 people were killed. Vladimir Putin blamed Chechen separatists and soon organised military action in Chechnya in retaliation. But Litvinenko wrote a book with Yuri Felshtinsky called Blowing Up Russia. Sensationally, it accused the Russian Secret Service of bombing Moscow themselves as a pretext to justify the war. And I'm told this was the second red line. He was working on stories alleging that Vladimir Putin was a paedophile. His main evidence appears to have been just one piece of footage in which Putin's seen kissing the stomach of a young boy during a public walkabout. Litvinenko's critics say he'd become obsessed with damaging the Russian president. Certainly the accusations were wild, and there can be little doubt about the danger.
When he started to write book, Blow Up Russia, he started to be dissident. And of course his association with very famous enemies of Mr. Putin here in London, of course, made him more like a dissident.
Marina Litvinenko. Her husband was also working on stories with the Russian journalist Anna Politskaya, stories that were again damaging to President Putin. She was murdered 2 weeks before he was. Litvinenko publicly blamed the president.
My name is Alexander Litvinenko. I am former KGB and FSB officer.
This was him addressing other Russian exiles at London's Frontline Media Club.
Здесь прозвучал прямой вопрос: кто убил Аню?
Somebody has asked you directly, who is guilty of Anna's death? Who has killed her?
Я даю прямой ответ. Аню убил господин Путин, президент Российской Федерации.
And I can directly answer you. It is Mr. Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, who's killed her.
Почему я так считаю?
Indeed, the Litvinenko inquiry set up by the UK government here in London saw video footage depicting Russian special forces using pictures of Litvinenko for firearms target practice. Ben Emerson, counsel for Marina Litvinenko, remarked there could hardly be a clearer indication that he was a target for deadly retribution. Officially, Russia continues to deny any involvement in Litvinenko's death, but some will say actions speak louder than words. Andrei Lugovoy was made a member of Russia's parliament in 2007, giving him immunity from prosecution. And this year, President Putin awarded him a medal for services to the motherland. Meanwhile, the other prime suspect, Dmitry Kovtun, said he wanted to give evidence to the inquiry, but pulled out at the last moment, saying it would jeopardise ongoing investigations in Russia.
What do you make of Kovtun and Lugovoy's denials?
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they?
Peter Clark.
The fact is that there's a huge body of evidence that's been put together and presented to the inquest about their alleged involvement in this, and one would expect them to deny everything.
We asked the Kremlin for its reaction to this programme, but got no reply. So our final word goes to former British prosecutor Ken MacDonald.
It was absolutely horrifying, if it's the case, that a foreign state felt empowered to carry out a murder of this sort on the streets of our capital city against a man who was under the protection of the British state.
Cynics will say, look, the Russian state simply doesn't care about any of this.
Well, I think if the finding of this inquest is that this murder was conducted at the behest of the Russian state, or that that's where the evidence most strongly points, the ramifications for the Russian state will be exceptionally serious. This is a hearing which has been conducted in London under the well-recognised standards of British justice, which are still widely admired around the world. I think a finding of that sort would have real credibility, and I think it will alter the way that millions and millions of people around the world view Mr. Putin and the Russian regime.
The Litvinenko inquiry has now finished its public hearings. It'll now go on to hear secret evidence from security forces. When it's all over, it's hard to see how the inquiry chairman will not implicate the Russian state. The killing of Alexander Litvinenko began the current chill in East-West relations. The Polonium Trail that's since been uncovered and stood up to legal scrutiny will hardly lead to any thaw. That's all from the Polonium Trail and me, Richard Watson. The producer was Mike Gallagher.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.